Honestly, I feel like this term is a bit of a pleonasm, because leadership, the way I understand it, should always be ethical under any conditions. So for me, this was an interesting approach also, that whenever I speak of leadership, you know, it's so much about leading by example, giving a good example, that basically, for me, being ethical is part of good leadership. Let's just call it good leadership. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, what does it mean in those terms? And I would really say that despite the leadership tasks that you have as a leader, right, you want to carry on people. I think it has a lot to do with, well, taking into account that you could, for example, lose a client because of misconduct. We could talk about whistleblowing, you know, in terms of, well, what do you do as a leader? How do you put processes in place that other people around you could report anything that is not ethical, right? I think that's a lot. So the examples for me come a lot from the whole legal perspective, of course, in banking, because they have had a lot of not so ethical leadership, but not only. So it's really, I think there's so many cases where we could say that. And then I also think it's interesting to think in terms of, you know, let's just look at the landscape of leaders we have had, or we have, right? Be it politicians, where unfortunately media coverage has been a lot towards, you know, also things that don't go so well with certain leaders. So we see that not everyone that becomes a leader by function, so I'm not talking about an innate leader, not everyone that becomes by function a leader remains ethical. And the higher you go, the harder it is. So the question should never be either or, because it feels a bit like, well, asking, should I do the right thing or should I do things right? And one without the other will always lead us to problems. So I think it's absolutely compatible with leadership focused on results. And maybe one important part is that you're not short-term focused, right? You really look into the long term. What does this mean for our company if we really take ethics into consideration? And sometimes that means you don't want to grow from quarter to quarter. I think Patagonia is an excellent example, where they've claimed quite some times already that they don't want to further grow. They really want to keep the base business going as it is. So I think that's a beautiful idea, which I really like to see as well. Yes and no. So I think ethical leadership is, for example, also not a new leadership style. So for me, I believe you can be a very autocratic, or no, I should really say the whole range of leadership. If you go from laissez-faire to the very directive leadership, that does never interfere with ethical behavior. You can be very laissez-faire and not ethical, or you can be a leader that is very directive, but still very ethical, right? So for me, I think ethical leadership is being implemented in some companies. And then we really need to look at, are we speaking about, you know, the management board, the employees at the bottom, right? And it's always individuals. And I would say it's very interesting how the dynamics of a group can work. Sometimes one person that is not ethical can influence the whole board, the whole management, a whole team, if those people don't have strong ethical views, right? If they don't have a good ethical compass, they will get lost and maybe follow the other people. So yeah, I have worked for a CEO that is meanwhile in prison and supposed to stay there for the next 80 years in the US. So And it's really interesting to, you know, observe what it does with other people around, right? Because usually maybe not so ethical people have other things that that support them in their behavior, right? It could be that they're very charismatic and people fall for this and they're influential. So I would say, yes, it is implemented. Why? Because we know we pay a price when we are not ethical. Also personally, not just the financial one. But of course, there's also companies where it's not being implemented. This is a very, very interesting question as well, because it's really about, so organizations consist of individuals. So ideally, there is like a pool of values that everyone has in common that really corresponds with the company's vision and mission. You know, there I would really also go with things that come from the individuals, such as justice, honesty, that people are value driven, and go along those ways. And then when we think of an organization, I also think it really depends on the type of organization. You know, should our values be driven more towards also creative and innovative things? But let's say we are lawyers and we work together, then, you know, I also want our values to be, you know, safety, justice, and precision. So I think there is also an important differentiation. I think there are general values, but they are interpreted very differently. So let's say if in a team event, I ask 20 people, what is your top value? About 80% will say respect is very important for me. But you have these 80% of people having different definitions of respect. So there is no clear answer of that, right? And then the cultural aspects come and play in as well. So that's the other part. So I think what's really important is, as a leader yourself, to be very clear about your own personal values, because they will be a compass in hard times. You know, if you have to decide, will I remain quiet in a meeting room, or should I raise my voice and point to something that is going wrong? When you are clear about your own values, that will always be helpful for such situations.